The War of the Austrian Succession involved most of the powers of Europe over the question of Maria Theresa's succession to the realms of the House of Habsburg. The war included King George's War in North America, the War of Jenkins' Ear, the First Carnatic War in India, and the First and Second Silesian Wars. The war began under the pretext that Maria Theresa was ineligible to succeed to the Habsburg thrones of her father, Charles VI, because Salic law precluded royal inheritance by a woman, though it was commonly thought that the challenge of liability was an excuse put forward by Prussia and France to challenge Habsburg power. Austria was supported by Great Britain and the Dutch Republic, the traditional enemies of France, as well as the Kingdom of Sardinia and the Electorate of Saxony. France and Prussia were allied with the Electorate of Bavaria. Spain, which had been at war with Britain over colonies and trade ever since 1739, entered the war on the continent to re-establish its influence in northern Italy, further reversing an Austrian dominance over the Italian peninsula that had been achieved at Spain's expense as a consequence of Spain's War of Succession earlier in the 18th century. The war ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, by which Maria Theresa was confirmed as Archduchess of Austria and Queen of Hungary, but Prussia retained control of Silesia. Background: in 1740, after the death of her father, Charles VI, Maria Theresa succeeded him as Queen of Hungary, Croatia and Bohemia, Archduchess of Austria and Duchess of Parma. Her father had been Holy Roman Emperor, but Maria Theresa was not a candidate for that title, which had never been held by a woman. The plan was for her to succeed to the hereditary domains, and her husband, Francis Stephen, to be elected Holy Roman Emperor. The complications involved in a female Habsburg ruler had been long foreseen, and Charles VI had persuaded most of the states of Germany to agree to the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. Problems began when King Frederick II of Prussia violated the Pragmatic Sanction and invaded Silesia on 16 December 1740, using the 1537 Treaty of Brieg as a pretext. Maria Theresa, as a woman, was perceived as weak, and other rulers put forward their own competing claims to the crown as male heirs with a clear genealogical basis to inherit the elected dignities of the great imperial title. Strategies: for much of the 18th century, France approached its wars in the same way. It would let its colonies defend themselves, or would offer only minimal help, anticipating that fights for the colonies would likely be lost anyway. This strategy was, to a degree, forced upon France. Geography, coupled with the superiority of the British Navy, made it difficult for the French Navy to provide significant supplies and support to French colonies. Similarly, several long land borders made an effective domestic army imperative for any ruler of France. Given these military necessities, the French government, unsurprisingly, based its strategy overwhelmingly on the army in Europe. It would keep most of its army on the European continent, hoping that such a force would be victorious closer to home. At the end of the war, France gave back its European conquests, and recovered such lost overseas possessions as Louisbourg, largely restoring the status quo ante as far as France was concerned. The British, by inclination as well as for pragmatic reasons, had tended to avoid large-scale commitments of troops on the continent. They sought to offset the disadvantage this created in Europe by allying themselves with one or more continental powers whose interests were antithetical to those of their enemies, particularly France. For the War of the Austrian Succession, the British were allied with Austria. By the time of the 7 Years' War, they were allied with its enemy, Prussia. In marked contrast to France, Britain strove to actively prosecute the war in the colonies once it became involved in the war. Taking full advantage of its naval power, the British pursued a dual strategy of naval blockade and bombardment of enemy ports, and also utilized their ability to move troops by sea to the utmost. They would harass enemy shipping and attack enemy outposts, frequently using colonists from nearby British colonies in the effort. This plan worked better in North America than but set the stage for the 7 Years' War. Silesian Campaign of 1740. Prussia in 1740 was an emerging power, a small but well-organized state whose new king, Frederick II, wanted to unify the disparate and scattered crown holdings by gathering intervening lands into a unified, contiguous state. Prince Frederick had been only 28 years of age on the 31st of May 1740 when his father, Frederick William I, died and Prince Frederick ascended to the throne. Although Prussia and Austria had been allies in the War of the Polish Succession, concluded only 2 years before, the interests of the two countries diverged when the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles VI, died on the 20th of October 1740. Emperor Charles VI had made provision for the succession of his daughter, Maria Theresa, to the throne as Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, although the Salic law prevented succession through the female line. During his lifetime, Emperor Charles VI obtained consent from several of the individual German states that were a part of the Holy Roman Empire for his Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, which circumvented the Salic law to allow his daughter to succeed to the throne. While the Austrian Habsburg monarchy was distracted by the succession, Frederick, upon coming to the throne, rejected the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713 and opportunistically invaded Silesia on the 16th of December 1740. In support of his invasion of Silesia, Frederick also used a questionable interpretation of a treaty between the Hohenzollerns and the Piasts of Brieg as pretext. What Frederick really feared was that other princes of Europe were preparing to exploit the succession struggle to acquire Habsburg possessions for themselves or diminish the power of the Holy Roman Empire. In particular, Frederick feared that Augustus III, Elector of Saxony and King of Poland, was preparing to seize Silesia for himself to unite Saxony and Poland. The only recent combat experience of the Prussian army was their participation in the War of the Polish Succession, in which the Prussian army had largely been kept out of combat. Nobody in the court of the Holy Roman Empire trusted the motives of the new rising power of Prussia, and therefore, the Holy Roman Emperor did not call on the Prussians, who were vassals of the Holy Roman Empire, for military support of the empire. Accordingly, the Prussian army had an uninspiring reputation and was counted as one of the many minor armies of the Holy Roman Empire. This reputation misrepresented the fact of a standing army of 80,000 soldiers representing 4% of the 2.2 million population of Prussia. Thus, the Prussian army was disproportionate to the size of the state it protected. By comparison, the Austrian Empire had 16 million citizens but had an army only half its authorized size because of financial restraints. Thus, in defending the vast territory of the Austrian Empire, this small army was more of a sieve than a shield against foreign invasion. Moreover, the Prussian army was better trained than other armies in Europe. King Frederick William I and the guiding genius of the Prussian army, Leopold I, Prince of Anhalt-Dessau or Old Dessau, had drilled the Prussian army to a perfection previously unknown in Europe. The Prussian infantry soldier was so well trained and well equipped that he could fire 4 shots a minute to an Austrian's 3 shots per minute, while Prussian cavalry and artillery were comparatively less efficient. They were still of better quality than average. Furthermore, while the Austrians had to wait for conscription to complete the field forces, Prussian regiments took the field at once. With this army, it might not have been surprising that Frederick was able to overrun Silesia. However, Frederick sought even more advantages in the war he was planning. Accordingly, he had his foreign minister Heinrich von Podewils secretly negotiate a treaty with France to put Austria in a two-front war. In this way, Prussia could attack the Austrians in the east while France would attack Austria from the west. A treaty with France was signed in April 1739. The Prussian army had massed quietly along the Oder River during early December, and on 16 December 1740, without declaration of war, Frederick moved his army across the frontier into Silesia. The extant forces available to the local Austrian generals could do no more than garrison a few fortresses, and they necessarily fell back to the mountain frontier of Bohemia and Moravia with only a small remnant of their available forces left in the garrisons. Of these fortresses in Silesia, only Glogau, Breslau and Brieg remained in Austrian hands following Frederick's initial campaign. The Prussians were able to capture the fortress at Olor almost immediately and use it as winter quarters. Thus the Prussians were able to go into winter quarters, holding all Silesia and investing the strongholds of Glogau, Brieg and Neustria. In one step, Prussia had effectively doubled its population and made huge gains in its industrial productivity and resource base. Allies in Bohemia, 1741. Early in the year, a new Austrian field army under General Wilhelm Reinhard von Nieperg relieved Neustria and marched on Brieg, threatening to cut the Prussians off. On 10 April, Frederick's army caught the Austrians on the snow-covered fields near Mollwitz. This was the first time that Frederick had led troops into battle. The victory that Frederick attained at the Battle of Mollwitz was a learning experience for the young king. Frederick obtained an alliance with the French against the Austrians, signing the Treaty of Breslau on 5 June. Accordingly, the French began to cross the Rhine on 15 August and joined the Bavarian electors' forces on the Danube and advanced towards Vienna. The combined forces of the French and the Bavarians captured the Austrian town of Linz on 14 September. However, at this point, the objective was suddenly changed, and after many countermarches the anti-Austrian allies advanced, in three widely separated corps, on Prague. A French corps moved via Amberg and Pilsen. The Elector marched on Budweis, and the Saxons invaded Bohemia by the Elbe Valley. The Austrians could at first offer little resistance, but before long a considerable force intervened at Tabor between the Danube and the Allies, and Austrian troops including Nieperg were soon transferred from Silesia back to the west to defend the Austrian capital, Vienna, from the French. With fewer Austrian troops in Silesia, Frederick now had an easier time. The remaining fortresses in Silesia were taken by the Prussians. Before he left Silesia, Austrian General Nieperg had made a curious agreement with Frederick, the so-called Klein-Schlendorf Agreement. By this agreement, the fortress at Neustria was surrendered after a mock siege, and the Prussians agreed to let the Austrians leave unmolested, releasing Nieperg's army for service elsewhere. At the same time, the Hungarians, moved to enthusiasm by the personal appeal, in September 1741, of Maria Theresia, had put into the field a levée en masse, or insurrection, which furnished the regular army with an invaluable force of 60,000 more light troops. A fresh army was collected under Field Marshal Kievenhuller at Vienna, and the Austrians planned an offensive winter campaign against the Franco-Bavarian forces in Bohemia and the small Bavarian army that remained on the Danube to defend the electorate. The French in the meantime had stormed Prague on 26 November 1741. Francis Stephen, husband of Maria Theresa, who commanded the Austrians in Bohemia, moving too slowly to save the fortress. The Elector of Bavaria, who now styled himself Archduke of Austria, was crowned King of Bohemia and elected to the imperial throne as Charles VII. But no active measures were undertaken. In Bohemia, the month of December was occupied in mere skirmishes. On the Danube, Kievenhuller, the best general in the Austrian service, advanced on 27 December, swiftly drove back the Allies, shut them up in Linz, and pressed on into Bavaria. Munich itself surrendered to the Austrians on the coronation day of Charles VII. At the close of this first act of the campaign, the French, under the old Marshal de Broglie, maintained a precarious foothold in central Bohemia, menaced by the main army of the Austrians, and Kievan-Huller was ranging unopposed in Bavaria. Frederick made a secret truce with Austria and thus lay inactive in Silesia. Campaigns of 1742. Frederick had hoped by the truce to secure Silesia, for which alone he was fighting. But with the successes of Kievan-Huller and the enthusiastic insurrection of Hungary, Maria Theresa's opposition became firmer, and she divulged the provisions of the truce to compromise Frederick with his allies. The war recommenced. Frederick had not rested on his laurels. In the uneventful summer campaign of 1741 he had found time to begin the reorganization of his cavalry. The training of the Prussian cavalry had been neglected by Friedrich's father, King Frederick William I, probably because he was an infantryman to his corps. The training of the cavalry had also been overlooked by the old Dessauer, who was the true genius behind the Prussian army. Frederick had been disappointed by the performance of his cavalry at the Battle of Mollwitz. However, as a result of Frederick's training of the cavalry over the summer of 1741, the Prussian cavalry would soon acquit themselves much better in the coming battles of the First Silesian War. Before long the cavalry would be more efficient than the Prussian infantry. The Emperor Charles VII, whose territories were overrun by the Austrians, asked him to create a diversion by invading Moravia. In December 1741, therefore, the Prussian General Field Marshal Kurt Christoph Graf von Schwerin crossed the border and captured Olmütz. Glatz also was invested, and the Prussian army was concentrated about Olomouc in January 1742. A combined plan of operations was made by the French, Saxons and Prussians for the rescue of Linz. But Linz soon fell. Broglie on the Vltava, weakened by the departure of the Bavarians to oppose Kievan-Huller, and of the Saxons to join forces with Frederick, was in no condition to take the offensive, and large forces under Prince Charles of Lorraine lay in his front from Budweis to Jihlava. Frederick's march was made towards Saglor in the first place. Brno was invested about the same time, but the direction of the march was changed, and instead of moving against Prince Charles, Frederick pushed on southwards by Znojmo and Mikolov. The extreme outposts of the Prussians appeared before Vienna, but Frederick's advance was a mere foray, and Prince Charles, leaving a screen of troops in front of Broglie, marched to cut off the Prussians from Silesia, while the Hungarian levies poured into Upper Silesia by the Jablunkov Pass. The Saxons, discontented and demoralized, soon marched off to their own country, and Frederick with his Prussians fell back by Svitavy and Litomyśl to Kutna Hora in Bohemia, where he was in touch with Broglie on the one hand and with Silesia on the other. No defense of Olomouc was attempted, and the small Prussian corps remaining in Moravia fell back towards Upper Silesia. Prince Charles marched past Jihlava and Teuchbrod on Kutna Hora in pursuit of Frederick. On the 17th of May 1742 Frederick turned around and faced the Austrian forces that were pursuing him. He fought the Austrians in what has become known as the Battle of Chotusitz. After a severe struggle Frederick won a major Prussian victory. At Chotusitz, it was Frederick's newly reorganized and trained cavalry that really won the victory and compensated for their previous failings. The cavalry's conduct gave an earnest prospect of its future glory, not only by its charges on the battlefield, but by its vigorous pursuit of the defeated Austrians. Almost at the same time the Battle of Chotusitz was occurring, French Field Marshal François Broglie fell upon a part of the Austrians left on the Vltava and won a small, but morally and politically important, success in the action of Sahay, near Budweis. Frederick did not propose another combined movement. Frederick's victory at Chotusitz, along with the victory of Field Marshal Berlier, persuaded Maria Theresa to seek peace even if it meant ceding away Silesia to make good her position elsewhere. Accordingly, a separate peace between Prussia and Austria was signed at Breslau on the 11th of June 1742, which drew the First Silesian War to a close. However, the larger War of the Austrian Succession continued.